Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be discussing such an important topic as part of our second webinar with our customers here. So thanks, we're going to give everyone just a couple minutes to join here. Today we'll be discussing CharHop DI self-ID campaigns. So it's going to be a great conversation. We'll get really tactical, learn about what customers are doing, and give you all some best practices for how to do this in your organization. Before we get started, you should have gotten an email yesterday to join our CharHub community. In that community, it's a Slack community. You'll find that we've added a self-ID channel where we'll be posting the poll questions for today and just have a broader discussion and basically kick off the conversation beyond the webinar. So definitely go in there and let's start having a conversation about this topic. There's so many ways to share these questions. So you can ask them during the session. If you want, just send them through Zoom. Put them in the self-ID channel, or at the end of the webinar, we're going to have a Q&A session as well. Feel free to vote up any questions with emojis. And as always, we're always here to support beyond this webinar. So if there's questions that you have that you may not get answered today, we'll definitely address those. Feel free to reach out and we'll definitely address those after. Great. So in terms of introductions, hey everyone, I'm Maria. I'm the head of marketing here at ChatHop. And I'm really excited to talk about this specifically because it's just been a huge driving force of my time at CharHop since the very beginning. It's something that I'm really passionate about, really excited about, especially just given the power of the visualization of the platform and how we can use both self-ID data as well as data coming in from different systems to help us create more diverse, equitable, inclusive workforces. So really excited to have this conversation with y'all.
Thank you, Maria, for kicking this off. Really excited to be here. My name is Rafael Fernandez, and I'm a customer success manager at ChartHop. And obviously, really excited to be able to do this.
Awesome. So definitely wanted to start with just why this matters. We saw this article get published as early as last week. We're really seeing the biggest companies in the space starting to tie diversity metrics to executive compensation. That has been a huge shift. Now we're seeing, we saw a bunch of companies doing this over the last year, and now it continued. We saw Starbucks, we saw Nike, we're continuing to see this, and we believe this is going to continue to be a trend that will drive a lot of the awareness and always almost like hold companies accountable to the changes that we want to see. So really excited to see these types of companies starting to put their money where their mouth is in terms of diversity. We also know that there's a lot of research that's gone into the gaps that exist in diversity across organizations in general. So whether it's gender pay gaps, whether it's representation gaps, you see this continues to be a common theme in organizations, both large and small. And companies are also starting to pay the price for unfair and unrepresentative practices. So not only is it something that this is the right thing to do, it's also going to continue to be costly for businesses if they don't get this right. And that's why we're so excited to have this conversation, because we can, one, set the foundation up for our companies to do this well from the very beginning. And if not from the very beginning, at least to start understanding where we're at now so we can start making those changes and hopefully avoid any potential issues in the future, because that's also going to cost the business, not just from an employee retention and engagement standpoint, but also hurt the bottom line. So when we're talking about committing to diversity, equity, inclusion, we really mean that. One, you get to know and understand your team. That is at the core of the most important part. You get to then analyze the data across your team and spot your trends early so that you can either put the initiatives in place, put the structures in place to tackle any issues that arise, and use that to plan for the future. All of these things are sort of pivotal, and this is how we think about what does it mean to commit to DEI, and how can we help support you through that process? So we'll kick it off with a quick poll. You should be seeing this in the Slack community. I don't have the
I'm
answers up
sending,
in front of me, Raf, so if you can,
yeah, I'm sending it right now. The self-ID.
perfect.
There we go.
Amazing.
So I think something that's really interesting is that when we think about DEI in general, there's a lot of like process and a lot of change management that kind of goes into it. And often when we talk to customers, it's not like a silver bullet, like, oh, we'll be able to send out a survey, or we'll be able to do an analysis. It's actually a combination of different things that we need to navigate together. And in this poll, kind of what we're trying to get a sense of is, you know, how are you navigating that today, and what are, you know, some of your priorities that you might have internally? It might be something like collecting data. Like, you know, you can't, it's very difficult to have visibility in your organizations without data. But in other cases, the data is already there, and it's really about developing a better analysis or obtaining executive buy-in, leadership buy-in, to really kick off an internal initiative.
Awesome.
There's a couple answers coming through. So we have developing better analysis, creating manager awareness, and nurturing an inclusive culture. I particularly like really think about nurturing an inclusive culture as really just critically important. That really starts in your onboarding and recruitment process, and also in kind of your brand definition.
Totally agree.
Cool. Let's keep on going.
Awesome. So our
So
goal of today's, oh, go for it, Garth.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
So our goal of today's webinar is to help you understand what is a DEI self-ID campaign, how ChartHop supports these DEI surveys through custom forms, which ChartHop bundles you can use to configure these settings in these forms in your account, so you can really easily deploy this in your account across your organization, and then also tools to just keep learning about DEI more broadly.
Yeah. I think when we let's talk about the first one first. So let's talk about the definition, because I do think that when we think about self-ID campaign, there's a lot of different potential kind of surveys and scopes that can come into play.
Great.
So when we think about self-ID in general, before we step into it, one of the things that I like to do is kind of take a step back and think about self-ID within the context of DEI in general. And if you can move forward on a slide, like when we think about employee data sources, self-ID is really just one of the many components where we're aggregating data directly from employees and from your community of employees. In the context of like engagement, you also have objectives management, you have performance reviews, and you also have like about me, like people's MBTI, or it could be the Enneagram, it could be favorite sports and skill sets and such. And really the combination of these, Maria, go ahead and go to the next one, is really what allows you to kind of be able to achieve those specific DEI objectives. It's using one individually, really, it gives you one perspective of the holistic picture, but really combining the data across all of them is really what gets us to the final objective. When we think about the self-ID too, an important thing to consider is kind of like what program you kind of have in place. I Internally we think about, here's a variety of different surveys and forms that we use to engage with the employee base, and you can see here that that some of them have different schedules, like self-ID survey being usually an annual survey versus, your annual engagement survey, but then performance reviews being maybe twice a year, objectives on a quarterly basis, and then more regularly when you're doing pulse surveys for EMPS or your one-on-one manager check-ins or your About Me. In terms of when you think about the rollout versus like new employees, when all of these are important, that when you're doing it the first time, you do it across the entire organization population. Like you might have a pilot program that we often recommend doing, so make sure that it's working as appropriate and it's also the communications are defined the right way. And a subset of these are also recommended during the onboarding process. The self-ID survey, for example, but also like setting up your objectives for a new employee, and also making sure that you have the right foundation for new employees to be able to connect with others, especially when we're in a remote environment. Surveys like About Me that talk about your interests and your hobbies can be really powerful to making employees feel welcome. We can move to the next one, Maria. And so I think we get to a question about what is a self-ID campaign. Maria, do you want to take this one?
Yes, if I can find where the unmute button is, that would be great. Yeah, so a self-ID campaign is a voluntary self-identification, hence self-ID, survey that collects data on the varying aspects of identity. Employees during this process have the opportunity to disclose if they have a disability, if they served in the military, if they're non-binary, LGBTQ, they're trans, anything. This is obviously very important that you think about what kind of questions you want to ask and what is important to your team to understand diversity across your organization, and also what's legal, depending on where your employees are. So it's very important to think about the sort of what the makeup of the self-ID survey is, and what's appropriate for your organization. The great aspects, the value of the self-ID survey is that it enables your people team to identify DEI issues and opportunities beyond the EEOC data that you gather directly from your HRIS or ATS. Things like, you can ask if they're a caretaker, you can look at socioeconomic status. There's a lot of different types of questions that you can ask to really get a broader look and sense of your employee makeup. These can then be, especially within ChartHop, you can then use this data to look at engagement, compensation, succession planning plans, career development, other areas of the employee journey, and really understand how different aspects of that journey affect different demographics, again, beyond the typical EOC data that you might be collecting. So it's really, really powerful. And of course, it is all voluntary. No employee should feel in any way required to answer these questions. They can answer one, they can answer none, they can answer all. It really is completely up to them, and it is just an opportunity to help them bring a fuller sense of who they are to your workplace.
One of the things that I think we always encounter is with regards to like sensitivity, and whether employees will feel comfortable enough sharing this type of very sensitive information. This often, is related to kind of communications. And Maria, you can talk also about your experience with other customers, but from what I've seen, it's really about what culture do we have in place to begin with? What communication process do we have? And also, am I clear in the accountability and expectations of what this is going to be used for? That's definitely from my side of what I've seen.
Definitely. And I think that companies that already have a culture of trust and transparency can really use this data and ask employees for this data in a way that doesn't feel in any way that it will be, leveraged for negative purposes. This data should not influence hiring decisions. It should not influence promotions, right? This data is to then look at what's happened, and it should only be accessible on an individual level by a very small group of people. Really, it's about looking at the aggregate and understanding how whether it's engagement, compensation, et cetera, affects different demographics in aggregate. but it should never be used to identify an individual,
Mm,
or provide different opportunities or lack thereof for that particular individual, right? I think that's a big aspect of the communications that you have to make sure your employees are aware of,
mm,
because particularly if they don't feel safe or don't understand how this data is going to be used, it could be it can actually be really really uncomfortable to be showing a part of yourself that you may not be as open, disclosing in other scenarios, right? So having that very open and transparent communication around like how you intend to use this data can go a really really long way.
yeah, I think that something that I would recommend to anyone who's considering doing their first self ID campaign is thinking about, hey, do have I talked to maybe some employees who are representative of my employee community today? And how are they feeling about this type of initiative and the communications that we should have? If there's a lot of apprehension in terms of participating in this type of campaign, then there's potentially, some groundwork that you'll need to do in terms of, exec buy-in and communications to create that sense of more safety so that you can do this work in the future.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that aspect of psychological safety, and why your employees would feel comfortable sharing this data is at the core of just like your cultural in general.
Yeah,
And you're right that if for some reason they don't feel that comfortable, then there's probably some issues to address there, to open that up.
yeah. So a quick poll. When was the last time your organization conducted a self-ID campaign? This year, last year, within the last 5 years, and not yet. I think self-ID campaigns, although they are quite a common topic of conversation now, I think a lot of organizations haven't necessarily done one recently. We usually recommend you do one once a year
Mhm.
to keep it refreshed and make sure that you capture um, any updates in the employee population.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing and seeing what people say here because I've heard, especially in the last 8 to 10 months, a lot of companies doing self ID surveys that hadn't done them before. So I'm wondering if that's the case across the attendees here. My dog feels that way.
All right, we've got one response, which is not yet. If you're listening on the call, just remember that you can join the Slack community that we set up, and then we're sending the polls to that Slack community.
And you should have the link in the chat. Oh, actually, let me share that with attendees right here. If you don't have yet the link to log into the community, I just sent it again. Amazing.
So, getting a bit more technical, you know, Chart Hop, obviously, where our culture and our product is really meant to create a sense of transparency and really like accessibility across the entire, across every customer that we have. And so within that, we have the ability to do what we call like custom forms. And specifically, there's a DI bundle that you can access in your ChartHop environment, and definitely get in contact with their customer success manager to help you get a lot of the specifics that will allow you to download a pre-created form that is for employee demographics and a self-ID form. And you can add this survey as essentially embedded into people's profiles, and we'll talk about the rollout in a second. And it asks questions related to everything from being member of the LGBTQA community, whether do you identify as transgender, and education history and such. Um, when when you do download this form, and we can move to the other slide, Maria, you have also the ability in ChartHop to do a variety of different types of customizations. Um, you know, we as ChartHop, we create a common template, but we do understand that each organization has their individual specific needs. That may be something as simple as changing the form title to say, your organization's name and self-ID campaign and the specific year. It can also mean that you want to change whether this shows up as what we call like a to-do, so sending it out to your employee population as a task versus setting it as active and telling employees that they can fill out their self-ID in their employee profiles. Other types of changes include the question labels. Who can complete it right now? It's for every individual person, and that makes sense. But it might be you might want to launch this for only a subset of the population as well. You can also adjust the who can see the information after it's submitted, and what this means is you can control, obviously, the level of sensitivity. This is critically important and should be aligned to definitely the expectations that you set with your organization. Most often, and our recommendation is that this is all set as highly sensitive information. And this means that only a very small amount of people, the owners of ChartHop, or let's say the HR specific HR business partners or administrators, can see the information that's provided by the employees for the within the form.
It's really great that you're able to customize literally every aspect of this because every
Yeah.
organization is so different. And what our goal here is to really provide you with here's the baseline, and this is the sort of like the best practice, but you know your organization better than we do, right? And you'll know exactly what messaging will resonate, what questions you want to ask, what questions like Raphael said, if there's specific questions you want to ask in certain locations or for certain departments, you can definitely do that. So definitely take advantage of just how customizable this information or this form really is.
Yeah, the one of the use cases for that is that you might be sending a self-ID form to people in different countries.
Hmm.
And that might mean that you want to customize, you might want to have two different types of self-ID forms that are aligned with the right language based on the specific country that a person is in. We have a customer, for example, who is using different language based on the local census information, and what the classifications that are used by the government to make sure that that language is not just consistent with government entities and regulation, but it's also consistent with what the individual employees will like expect.
Yep.
After you configure the survey, then you can roll it out. And there's a couple different options in terms of how you roll it out that I mentioned a bit previously. One of which is in the employee profile, you can add it as complete form and have that form available for people to complete on an ad hoc basis when they feel comfortable filling it out, and maybe not necessarily as a broad-based program. Uh, you can also email the link of the form. So when you go to the form settings, there is an area where you have a generic link that you can send out. And often these communications, since they're a bit more sensitive, are sometimes managed internally, right? You send the link. One option that is not mentioned here is actually we have a functionality called review functionality, where ChartHop automatically sends what we call like a task to employees that shows up in the dashboard area as kind of like a to do. And that's really useful because that way when employees log into ChartHop, the first thing that they kind of see is, hey, by the way, we've sent out this new survey we'd like you to fill out that also is tied to, for example, could be Slack notifications or sending reminders via email. Once the data is received from each of the employees, the people with sensitive access to the data can then use it for visualization and reporting. In this example, we have highlighting people by ethnicity, and then in the next slide, we have different types of reporting that you can do in terms of a point in time reporting. So it could be a pie chart of your gender distributions, or it could be time series. And this is the time series is particularly very useful because over time you can look at, for example, in this case, the percent of female participation by different types of data cuts. In this case, it's kind of like whether the percent female participation in the leadership group, in the manager population, and then as individual contributors. I'm a huge fan of this and increasing the visibility of these types of trends.
Yeah, and I love this too because you're able to share these types of reports in aggregate across the team without the underlying data itself, right? So that means that across the organization, you can share the metrics. You can give this to different, whether it's like managers or different leaders within the HR team to understand, where there are gaps and what you need to work on without disclosing any individual's information. And there's a ton of power in that.
Yeah. I think one of the things that sometimes like trips us up though is that even though we get the data and we do some data cuts, we have trouble transitioning that into what do we do about it. And it made me think of this kind of visualization that it's a meme, and it has made its rounds around Reddit and Twitter, and the importance of kind of like connecting the information that you have now gathered from the employee population to the broader context of the conversation. So with that in mind, I wanted to do another poll to ask about which data do you analyze for your DEI initiatives. There's a variety of different options here. It's kind of multiple choice and multi-select. And it'd be good to understand how you integrate or you have integrated that type of DEI information into the other types of programs that HR in general usually leads.
And as you're filling that out, just quick a reminder that we do have a Q&A feature as well. So if you have questions or want to start a discussion, you can feel free to ask questions. We'll have some room at the end, some time at the end for questions. So feel free to start putting some of those in the community as well.
I think, I don't know, Maria, when you look at this list, what do you think are the most common ones versus maybe some of the least common ones, but based on kind of your conversations with customers and exposure?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes up the most is really compensation. I think because it's a hard metric that hard meaning it's a tangible metric that it's sort of easier to measure across the company, right? It's a number, it's easy. I think performance reviews become a little bit more subjective by nature, so that's slightly different. And a lot of these, like onboarding, even succession planning, everything benefits is slightly easier, but the one that people are just starting to that people start with is really representation and compensation. Really, I haven't talked to many organizations yet who are really thinking about the even like career pathways more holistically. There's conversations around, okay, are we promoting fairly, and Are we thinking about, when we look at our promotions, are
Mhm,
we looking at who we're promoting and making sure that
mhm.
ties to performance and making sure that that ties to sort of objective feedback and sort of a goal attainment.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of research out there that shows that even performance reviews can be really biased depending on which behaviors you look for, and whether those are traditionally behaviors that are portrayed by certain demographics, et cetera. So there's just a lot of bias in a lot of these aspects. So it's interesting to see that really people tend to move toward the compensation bucket, but it's really in the other ones where there's a ton of potential, and it's part of the reason, or part of the challenge, is that this data isn't usually centralized, right? It's not
Yeah.
easy to
Yeah.
look at what are the career pathways tied to demographics, or how do your performance reviews tie to compensation. So I think what we're doing here is really, really unique. And even in some conversations that I have with customers, we're really just opening it's really about the opening the imagination of, like, what can you do with this data now that you have it? Whereas before, the spreadsheet gymnastics definitely serve as a blocker to even thinking
Yeah.
about what's possible.
I think traditionally, I think the employee journey. I This is my experience, but um, in my experience, the employee journey was often lean towards a one size fits all. Like, you
Mhm.
think about benefits as, okay, what's my benefit package for my entire employee base, or what are the standard career pathways, and more from the point of view of the business, like what will the business provide, and the business solution is maybe a one pack solution. What is my one onboarding process? And I think by taking a step into, the doing a self ID campaign and talking about diversity, it's we need to kind of invert that conversation a bit, so that when we think about how the business engages with the employee community, it's really about what do the different groups of the employee community, what do the different individuals need, and then how does the business support those individual needs.
Definitely. And like one thing that I notice we don't have on here is even just employee engagement as a whole. And I'd be
Yeah.
remiss if we're doing a DEI webinar, we don't talk about the hate crimes that are happening right literally last night against, like, Asian American women specifically, and how things like that, whether it was like everything that's happening right now against the Asian community, what happened last summer with against the Black community, and continues to the just like the systemic racism that is consistently prevalent in our society, that affects our employees, right? We don't live in a parallel universe where work is separate from our day to day, especially not right now during this work from home time. And in order to really support every single employee in the way they need to be supported, we need to know who they are. We need to know where they stand. We need to know how they're feeling. And I think companies are getting more aware of the importance of that, especially now that you don't see people in the office, and or almost like you have to try harder, right? You have to do more to really bridge that gap. Um,
Yeah.
so
I think,
it is a really important topic to discuss.
yeah, yeah, no, definitely.
All right, I'll move
Okay.
on to the next slide here.
So here's just some examples of utilizing the data within context, right? We talked about compensation planning, and definitely talk to your customer success managers if you're interested in that, because ChartHop does have a fantastic set of modules that enable you to do comp planning really well. So that then you can tie this all kind of seamlessly together within the same environment. Same thing with what we talked about, performance reviews. What are the ratings? How do they differ between gender and ethnicity? Yeah, and actually, I was just running an analysis for a customer a couple days ago, where we noticed that there was a slight difference between male and female comp planning and reviews, where males had a higher, it seemed like, I mean, again, I haven't done the statistical analysis, I just saw the graphs, but there's a clear difference between the male population that was having like a flat, a more spiky curve. So it's more probable that you were have either a lower rating versus a very high rating, versus females had a higher probability of being like ranked like average. So kind of more like a normal bell curve. And that actually reflected in the same way in the comp planning, where males had either lower raises or higher raises, and females had a more of an average distribution, which meant both male and female had the same averages at the end of the day, but the distribution of those merit increases were actually quite different between them. And sorry, go ahead, Maria. Not sure if you want to react to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of the things that I talk to customers about a lot is to look beyond the average, right? Like the average doesn't tell you the whole story. It tells you a very, very actually limited story. And the looking at the ranges, looking at really diving deep into the data and having the capabilities to do that is so valuable, because you can actually spot things like this. So I'm just, yeah, really interesting analysis. And I hope that by having a platform that allows you to do this, that people actually take advantage of it and are able to spot a lot of these inconsistencies, or and maybe there's a reason for it, right? We don't know why that's the case, but at least like knowing and being able to dive deeper into the data and understanding the why can help us bridge the gaps that we see across the industry today, right? So really interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
So we can move to the next one. The Maria, you want to talk a little bit about more ChartHop resources? I know this you have a bit more information than I do on all of these.
Yeah, definitely. So back in October, we put together this report across our customer base. It's a first annual Charting Better Workplaces report, and it really aims to look at our customers' data in aggregate across different demographics and sort of organizational and structural aspects of the workplace, right? So we look at representation across gender, across leadership positions versus individual contributors. We look at representation and compensation across different departments. It's a really, really interesting, some really interesting findings, and it's really just the beginning, right? As we work with more customers and are able to sort of make the database even more robust, we'll be able to do some really interesting analysis and highlight whether it's how existing gaps or how we're getting better. We did see some improvements in a lot of areas. So highly recommend that you all take a look at that report and get excited for the next one coming out. Then back in June, we released the comprehensive DI reporting. It's a deeper view into how you can slice and dice DI data to really, a lot of what Rafael was saying earlier, to really get at these deeper insights. So if this is a great takeaway from this webinar that you can take back to your team and essentially come up with a plan of how are you going to collect this data? How are you going to distribute and understand and analyze this data and then share this data more broadly? How will you hold yourself accountable, your company accountable, and the broader, how can you share this with the broader team to make sure that everyone is on the same page, everyone's aware of the goals, and you're able to tackle them together. And then finally, we also released a guide around, given the rise of remote work and the rise of like fully distributed as well as hybrid organizations. There's been a lot of conversations around how do you set salaries and how do you set compensation fairly, whether it's location-based, whether it's value-based. Should everyone have, is it equal pay for equal work, or should it be defined on your cost of living? And if you live in San Francisco and New York versus in Atlanta, what does that mean? There's some really interesting, I think, corollaries to diversity here in particular, just knowing that there are certain locations that have certain demographics more and less, right? So as you're thinking about a diverse and fair compensation strategy, how do you look at the data and make sure that the strategy that you're setting makes sense for your company and is also setting a baseline for fair compensation across different demographics in your organization? So that report has just or that guide has a lot of different examples as well as things to look out for as you're defining what your strategy is going to look like, especially now that we're kind of wrapping up for that return to a new normal, if you will. And all of these can be found on the ChartHop website under our resources page.
Thanks, Maria. I think with that, we just want to open it up to some questions. I know this was a brief overview of the SelfID, and we talked a little bit about the technical aspects, but we do welcome any questions from the audience. And then after that, we can go ahead and close out.
Great. And you can either send those questions in through the Zoom or through the community Slack, or just ping me directly. One question I got from a customer was how should they go about sharing this data, and how do they, once you distribute it and have it across and have the information, what's the best way to share that across within your organization? And if you want to do this in the market, what does that look like as well? So I can share some tips on that. The first thing is to, once you collect that data, definitely like analyze, understand it, and also look at where are the gaps right now? Where do you want to go? I think the most important aspect of sharing this data, especially if it's not where you want to be, is to come in to your broader employees with a plan of, okay, this is where we're at today. It's not where we want to be, and this is what we're going to do to get there. I think having that proactive conversation will be really helpful and help employees see that, okay, you acknowledge that there's an issue and that you're doing something about it, and that there's already a plan in motion to address it. The second piece to that is to also make employees feel like they are a part of the solution, right? So it's not, hey, this is exactly what we're going to do and that's it, but it's really like, hey, here's some ideas of what we think we can do to make it better. Let us know what you think. Give us your ideas too, because at the end of the day, creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces is not just HR's role. It's not just your DEI, your head of DEI's role. It is everyone's role. It starts at the top and it goes all the way through the organization. So making sure that everyone is on the same page and buys into, one, the importance of creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture, and it feels like they can be part of the solution, is really, really powerful. For companies that feel that they are, this very much depends on your culture or on your brand, but if you feel like you are able to share this with the market, I think there's a ton of power in that, because once you put out a public statement, you're holding yourself accountable to a different level. That's why we see a lot of these public companies, and we see companies like Asana who have great, and like HubSpot who have great websites where they track all their metrics and they make that public. I think it's great both from like an employer branding standpoint, because it allows employees to see, okay, will I belong here and how do I fit in? And also just helps companies, again, hold themselves accountable, which I think is really, really important, so that we can, especially in a fast moving tech world, can balance all of the goals and achievements that we're all trying to hit, because this is really, really important, and building a great company starts with building a great team. So those are some thoughts there.
One comment that I just wanted to add is that when you think about the self ID campaign, uh, there's a component about data gathering, but a big component of it is education. And if you
Mhm.
haven't run a self ID campaign yet, it's it's important to pair the survey with additional resources for employees who are participating in the survey who can read more about, let's say, different sexual orientations, or whether it be about different disabilities that might exist in the workplace. Often, people who might not have a disability may not be educated or may not understand, the different ones that might exist around them. So definitely use it as an opportunity to create awareness and educate your employee community on the diversity of your workplace.
Definitely. And we know that these are definitely sensitive subjects. So please always feel free to reach out to your customer success manager. If you want to reach out to me, to anyone on the ChartHop team, we're more than happy to either like brainstorm with you, be a thought partner in how to launch these campaigns, have these conversations. We also have a lot of partners we work with who are deep experts in DEI space. So if you ever need any resources beyond what Charhub can offer, we're more than happy to introduce you there. So definitely trying to help you, empower you to do this within your organizations, and we're always here as a resource.
The last thing that I'll just say is definitely encourage you guys to connect of the customers who are in the attendees. Take a look at the other attendees that are there. Take a look at the people who are in the Slack channels, and obviously, definitely be courteous and discreet, but data safety first. But make sure to connect with your peers and ask them about their programs and about their internal processes. I think we all learn quicker and get better much faster together.
Totally agree.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.